No one expected what was about to happen when a federal judge tried to silence Karoline Leavitt with a ruthless legal ambush, but they had no idea what was coming next. It was the final day of a courtroom showdown that had gripped the nation. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was overflowing. News crews, political commentators, everyday citizens packed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked on the towering mahogany doors of courtroom 6B. Social media buzzed like wildfire. Mount Leavitt v's Justice was trending worldwide, and live stream viewership had hit over 12 million. Karoline Leavitt, former White House staffer turned rising political firebrand, stood poised, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, her expression unreadable. To her, this wasn't just a lawsuit. It was about her reputation, her freedom of speech, and the truth. For months she'd been painted as an extremist, a manipulator, a threat to judicial decorum, all stemming from one televised confrontation with Judge Ronald Kessler, a man known for his rigid rulings, cold demeanor, and quiet influence. Behind the scenes, Judge Kessler wasn't just a judge. He was the judge, the kind of man whose decisions shaped national precedent. But today, he sat at the defendant's table. Accused of abusing judicial power, leaking sealed records to discredit Leavitt, and most damning, conspiring with political operatives to sabotage her career. The stakes? $800 million in damages, yes, but more than that, it was about vindication, about whether one woman could stand up to a titan of the legal system and win. And the moment Karoline opened her mouth, the entire room shifted. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel too loud. Judge Ronald Kessler's legal team had been quiet, until now. His lead attorney, Warren Rothstein, stepped forward like a lion sizing up wounded prey. A veteran litigator with a silver mane and a tongue as sharp as a guillotine, Rothstein was known for tearing witnesses apart with surgical precision. He adjusted his Italian cufflinks, then slowly walked toward the witness stand where Karoline Leavitt sat, back straight, jaw set, hands folded with military discipline. "Ms. Leavitt," Rothstein began, his tone dripping with mock politeness, "you've told this court that your career was nearly destroyed. But let's not pretend you're some innocent. Weren't you the one who repeatedly used your platform to publicly criticize Judge Kessler, calling him a tyrant in robes?" A soft murmur ran through the gallery. Karoline didn't flinch. "Did you, or did you not say that?" Rothstein pressed, circling her like a hawk. "Yes," Karoline answered calmly. "I said those words on national television." Rothstein smirked and turned to the jury. "So we agree, you're not the victim here. You're the instigator, a political provocateur using inflammatory language for attention. Isn't that right?" Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Is it inflammatory?" she said, voice smooth but steady, "if it turns out to be true?" That line hit harder than anyone expected. A few audience members raised eyebrows. Someone coughed nervously. On Twitter, a clip of that one-liner was already circulating under the hashtag #LeavittUnfiltered. Rothstein paced again, switching gears. "You built your brand criticizing the justice system. Yet now you run to that same system asking for $800 million. Sounds a bit hypocritical, doesn't it?" Karoline leaned forward slightly, not backing down. "Criticism of injustice is not rejection of justice. It's a call for accountability. That line drew a faint from the back of the courtroom. Still, Rothstein wasn't finished. "Let's talk credibility," he said, sliding a manila folder onto the evidence table. "You once claimed Judge Kessler was leaking documents to a journalist named Rebecca Dwyer, but Dwyer denied ever speaking to you. Are we just supposed to believe you're psychic?" Karoline paused. The courtroom hushed. Then she leaned into the mic. "No, I'm not psychic, but I do read emails." Gasps. "What emails?" Rothstein barked. Karoline gestured to her attorney, who stood and passed a stack of printed communications to the court clerk. "These were subpoenaed 2 weeks ago," she said. "They're direct emails between Judge Kessler's clerk and Ms. Dwyer, sharing sealed information. The timestamp aligns exactly with the story that tanked my reputation." Boom. It was the first real tremor of the day. The judge, presiding over the trial, glanced down at the documents, frowning. Several jury members leaned forward, Phones vibrated across the gallery as the first headlines hit Twitter. Breaking. Leavitt produces emails alleging Judge Kessler leaked info to journalist Rothstein. Took a beat, clearly rattled, but he tried to recover. "And you just happened to find those emails," he said, voice rising. "How convenient." Karoline didn't blink. "I didn't find them. I fought for them. For 6 months. Through red tape, denials, and a federal motion. And now that they're here, maybe the real question is, why? Did your client fight so hard to keep them hidden?" The room went still. A juror actually nodded. Rothstein's smirk was gone now. He returned to his table with less confidence than he'd arrived with, whispering something sharply into Kessler's ear. Meanwhile, Karoline sat silently, breathing slow and steady. Social media was exploding. She'd just fried him. Leavitt came armed. That folder slam was a cinematic moment. In a single round, Karoline had done the unthinkable. She turned her defense into an offensive, challenging not just the credibility of her opponent, but the very integrity of the legal system that allowed it to happen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. But the effect was seismic, and the jury felt it. But that was just the beginning. What happened next changed everything. Warren Rothstein returned to the center of the courtroom like a wounded predator, blood in the water, pride on the line. Karoline Leavitt had landed a hit he didn't expect. Now he was ready to draw blood in return. The lights above seemed harsher, the murmurs in the gallery sharper. Phones were held just below eye level as reporters live-tweeted every word. Judge Ronald Kessler sat motionless, face tight, lips pursed. Rothstein didn't waste time. "Let's talk about your resume," he sneered, walking back toward Karoline. "You tout yourself as a fighter for justice, a voice for the voiceless. But you're a communications advisor from a wealthy New England family with Ivy League contacts. Isn't it true, Ms. Leavitt, that your father owns 3 private properties in Vermont?" Karoline didn't respond. "Not yet. So what exactly qualifies you to speak on behalf of Americans who've actually been marginalized by the system?" Rothstein jabbed. "Is this courtroom just another stage for your political theater?" A couple of jurors frowned. Someone in the gallery muttered, "Low blow." Karoline's eyes narrowed just slightly, but her composure never cracked. "You're suggesting I don't understand injustice because I didn't grow up in poverty," she replied, voice even. "I'm suggesting," Rothstein shot back, "that your pain, if we can call it that, is manufactured. A marketing stunt for your political ambitions. You're not here for justice, you're here for attention." It was a brutal hit, one meant to humiliate her in front of the nation. Cameras flickered in the gallery. Social media instantly lit up. Rothstein goes for the kill, accuses Karoline of faking her victimhood. Is this about justice or career revival? Twitter divided. But Karoline remained still, like a storm gathering just off the coast. Then she spoke. "My father does own property in Vermont," she said plainly, "and I never claimed to come from poverty. What I do claim is that power should never be used to silence dissent." A pause. The courtroom leaned in. "Judge Kessler used his bench to smear me, because I criticized him, because I didn't fall in line. My financial background doesn't disqualify me from fighting back. It gives me the resources to expose him so that others without those means don't have to suffer in silence." That flipped the attack on its head. She turned privilege into purpose. "And for the record," Karoline added, voice rising just enough, "when the story broke that I was under federal investigation, my corporate partners dropped me. My contract with Patriot Media was pulled. My team disbanded. I lost everything I'd built." She looked straight at Rothstein. "That wasn't a stunt. That was sabotage." Gasps echoed. Even Judge Kessler shifted slightly in his seat. Rothstein pressed on, this time angrier, sloppier. "You also claimed in interviews that Judge Kessler violated judicial ethics. Yet you've never practiced law. You're not a lawyer. So what gives you the right to throw around accusations like that?" Karoline raised her chin. "I don't need a law degree to know that leaking sealed court documents to the press is illegal," she replied coolly. "I don't need a JD to recognize corruption. That's called common sense." That line landed with force. One juror smiled. Another shook their head, stunned. And in the back of the courtroom, someone whispered, "She's killing him up there." Rothstein clearly irritated, changed tactics again. He opened a large screen behind him, flashing up a still image from one of Karoline's most viral moments, a fiery speech where she'd called out the elitist judicial class. "Let's revisit this moment," he said, hitting play. "Your words, Ms. Leavitt. If judges want to play politics, we'll treat them like politicians." He paused the video again. "Are you telling this court that this isn't a targeted campaign to punish a judge you disagree with politically?" Karoline leaned forward. "No," she said. "I said what I meant. Judges shouldn't play politics. But if they do, if they step out of the bounds of impartiality, if they weaponize their power to silence critics, then yes, they should be held accountable like politicians." A beat passed. "This lawsuit isn't about revenge," she continued. "It's about restoring balance, because if a federal judge can destroy someone's life with a leak and face no consequences, then we don't have a justice system. We have a monarchy in robes." That line hit like thunder. A low "whoa" swept through the room. On Instagram, clips from the speech hit reels with captions like, "Karoline Leavitt, we don't have a justice system, we have a monarchy in robes." "This is how you respond to character assassination." Rothstein stood frozen for a moment, trapped between fury and fear. The audience saw it, the jury felt it. He had tried to break her, humiliate her, paint her as out of touch and opportunistic. But Karoline didn't just survive the ambush, she turned it into a weapon, and the courtroom knew it. But the next move from Rothstein would be his biggest mistake yet. Warren Rothstein wasn't used to losing, and judging by the subtle clench of his jaw, the sweat glistening at his temple, and the stiffness in his shoulders, he could feel it slipping. Control, narrative, power. He had tried sarcasm, reputation attacks, say class warfare. Karoline Leavitt had brushed them off like ash from a burning building, so now he played his final card, the unbeatable trap, the one designed not to provoke emotion, but confusion. The one even her most loyal supporters might not see coming. He stepped back to the screen behind him and brought up a document, dense, packed with legal jargon, footnotes, and internal court procedural codes. "Your Honor," he began with faux humility, "with the court's permission, I'd like to clarify just how reckless Ms. Leavitt's accusations are." Kessler nodded, wary but curious. Rothstein turned to Karoline with the smug certainty of a man convinced he was about to deliver the final blow. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, voice syrupy with condescension, "you've repeatedly accused Judge Kessler of violating federal judicial canons, specifically Canon 3C1 and Canon 2A. Tell us, without notes, what the full text of Canon 3C1 states and how it applies here. Please include its exception clauses." The courtroom froze. Even Karoline's legal team stiffened. It was a trap, plain and simple, meant to humiliate her for not being a lawyer, for daring to speak legal truths without credentials. Even the jurors looked uncertain. Could she quote it? Would she bluff? Would this be her undoing? Rothstein folded his arms, smirking. Karoline blinked once, twice, and then, without breaking eye contact, she calmly said, "Canon 3C1 requires a judge to disqualify themselves in any proceeding in which their impartiality might reasonably be questioned, including when the judge has a personal bias or prejudice concerning a party or personal knowledge of disputed evidentiary facts." The smirk began to slip from Rothstein's face. Karoline continued, unwavering. "Exceptions exist, such as where the bias arises solely from participation in the case, but those exceptions don't apply when a judge leaks privileged information to journalists off the record before the ruling is issued." Gasps. Rothstein's hand twitched, an involuntary tick. She wasn't just prepared, she knew the rule, word for word, with the exception clause, and then she went for the jugular. "Would you like me to recite Canon 2A next?" she asked smoothly. "Or should I summarize the judicial ethics opinion issued by the D.C. Circuit in 2019 that affirms leaking sealed documents violates the standard of impartiality?" The gallery erupted into whispers. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Karoline just quoted Canon 3C1 verbatim. Without notes, crowd stunned. "She's not a lawyer, but she just made one look like an intern." Rothstein tried to recover, voice faltering. "Then explain this," he snapped, pulling up another exhibit, an obscure procedural memo issued by the Federal Judicial Center in 2004. This document, Exhibit 42A, states that non-disciplinary informal guidance from internal review boards is protected under confidentiality protocols. Isn't it true you violated those protocols by including excerpts in your countersuit? He leaned forward, confident again. Yes or no, did you cite a confidential memo in your public filing? Karoline didn't flinch. She reached toward her binder, not for defense but to teach. This document, she said, holding up a nearly identical version, was declassified in 2007. The section I cited is public record, published in the Congressional Record on April 9th of that year. She turned to the jury, lifting the printout. His version, she said, pointing to Rothstein's screen, has the same footnote numbers. The difference? Mine has a Library of Congress stamp, his doesn't, which means either he pulled an outdated memo or he's hoping none of you would know the difference. Gasps turned into audible laughter. One juror chuckled aloud. Even Judge Kessler raised an eyebrow. Rothstein's face paled. His trap had backfired, publicly, irrevocably. Karoline stepped forward. You see, she said, addressing the courtroom now, this wasn't about whether I'm a lawyer. It was about whether I did my homework, whether I knew what I was talking about, whether the truth matters more than the title. She turned to Rothstein. You banked on the assumption that I was just some political figure chasing headlines, but I came prepared for this, because I've lived it. Thunderous silence. Then, one clap, another. Then, the whole gallery joined in. Even the stenographer paused, visibly impressed. Karoline stood tall, radiant in calm defiance. Her eyes scanned the crowd, resting briefly on the judge, and then she dropped the bombshell. Warren Rothstein had made a career out of dominance. His reputation was ironclad. His voice, once enough to silence rooms, now barely held the attention of a jury that just 15 minutes ago saw him as untouchable. He tried to steady himself, gripping the podium, eyes darting between the judge and jury. But the rhythm was gone, his tone wavered. His arguments, once sharp as razors, now landed with dull thuds. Let's not get distracted here, Rothstein said, gesturing vaguely at the projector screen still displaying Karoline's damning metadata reference. We're not here to nitpick timestamps or quibble over footnotes. This case is about defamation, about Ms. Leavitt's irresponsible attempt to destroy the reputation of a respected federal judge. He turned to the jury, attempting to reset. The emotional temperature. You don't need a legal degree to see what's happening here. A political firebrand trying to make a name for herself, weaponizing half-truths for a payout. That's what this is about. But his voice cracked at the end, and the jury noticed. So did the gallery. One woman in the second row leaned toward her friend and whispered, not quietly enough, "He's rattled. He wasn't expecting her to actually win this." Another reporter live tweeting caught the shift. Rothstein scrambling to recover, jury looked skeptical. Karoline hasn't flinched once. Karoline stood, slowly, deliberately. She didn't need to raise her voice. The silence waiting for her said everything. I'm glad Mr. Rothstein brought up reputation, she said calmly, because that's exactly what Judge Kessler tried to destroy when he orchestrated a media leak smearing me before I even had a chance to testify. She turned to the jury. You were told I filed this lawsuit for money, but let me ask you, what is the cost of being labeled a liar by a federal judge on national TV before you've had the chance to defend yourself? A pause. What's the cost of getting death threats sent to your family's home because someone in power decided your voice didn't matter? You could hear the breath catch in several jurors' throats. Karoline walked toward the evidence, screen and tapped it. This isn't about politics, it's about a basic question. Are the people we trust with power allowed to lie, to smear, and to ruin lives without consequence? She turned back to Rothstein, her eyes like steel. You called this case irresponsible. I call it necessary. She flipped to a new exhibit, an email chain between Judge Kessler's assistant and a New York Times legal affairs editor. You said I fabricated claims, she said. But here's the email thread requesting the leak to be positioned carefully to damage my credibility before my book release. You said this wasn't about footnotes, but those footnotes told the truth. You just weren't counting on me finding them. Rothstein opened his mouth to object, then hesitated. What could he say? Karoline wasn't spinning stories. She was quoting his client's emails. His hands now gripped the podium like a life raft. That email, he sputtered. That doesn't prove intent. It could be context, misunderstood. But no one was listening anymore, even. The judge looked stunned, and Karoline wasn't finished. You want to talk about ambition? She said, voice rising just slightly. Here's the truth. I could have settled. I was offered money to settle quietly, but I didn't want money. I wanted the truth. I wanted to walk back into this courtroom, look each of you in the eye, and prove that even if you don't have power, credentials, or elite friends, you still deserve justice. The crowd erupted into spontaneous applause. One juror, a retired nurse, nodded, misty-eyed. Another leaned forward, visibly engaged, scribbling something furiously onto their notepad. Rothstein tried again to salvage what little ground he had. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't a courtroom speech contest. This is about law, about precedent, about facts. Karoline cut in, gently but firmly. Exactly. And the facts are on record, yours included. She raised a thick folder and handed it to the bailiff. Inside is a deposition from a former judicial clerk who resigned after being pressured to ghostwrite rulings in favor of Judge Kessler's political allies. The affidavit is signed and time-stamped, and it's admissible. Rothstein staggered back a step. That name wasn't supposed to be public. She had gotten to the whistleblower, and the moment it sank in, his composure finally cracked. This is a farce, he barked, suddenly furious. She's grandstanding, turning a courtroom into a stage. Karoline tilted her head almost sympathetically. You're right, Mr. Rothstein. This is a stage. She turned slowly to the jury. Because for far too long, people like you and Judge Kessler have had the script, the spotlight, the final word. But not today. Not anymore. The courtroom, for a full 10 seconds, was silent. No coughing, no typing, just tension so thick you could almost hear it snap. Then, Karoline Leavitt just flipped the courtroom again, Rothstein visibly shaken. Judge Kessler staring into the desk. Jury now fully locked in on Karoline. She has the momentum. Even the court officer near the door whispered to a colleague, I think she's going to win. Karoline stood with quiet resolve, gaze steady. And though it felt like the world had tilted on its axis, she hadn't declared victory, not yet. But the final moment of truth was still to come. Warren Rothstein looked cornered, yet he hadn't given up. His suit was immaculate, but his eyes told a different story. The sharp prosecutor who once dismantled CEOs and senators now looked like a man drowning in his own arrogance. Still, pride wouldn't let him sink quietly. He stepped forward with a grin that was all teeth and no confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest, he said, pacing before the jury like a frustrated magician trying one last sleight of hand. We've let this spiral. This trial, this spectacle, it's turned into a media circus. Ms. Leavitt came in with a mission, not justice, but fame. That's what this is, that's all this is. He turned toward Karoline, shaking his head slowly. You've played your part brilliantly, I'll admit. You've weaponized emotion, cherry-picked context, and cast yourself as David to my Goliath. His voice softened, dripping with condescension. But real life isn't a movie, Ms. Leavitt. You don't get to win just because you cry prettier or speak louder. The courtroom stiffened. It was the wrong tone at the worst time. Karoline didn't flinch. She stood, slow, purposeful, like someone about to deliver a eulogy, not a rebuttal. Then she walked toward the center of the courtroom and looked directly at the jury. You're right, she said calmly. Real life isn't a movie. She turned to Rothstein. In movies, the villain monologues before losing. In real life, they just lie until people stop listening. A ripple of laughter spread through the gallery, but she wasn't smiling. I never wanted to be famous. I wanted to be heard. But every time I tried to speak up, someone like you told me I was too emotional, too young, too female. She raised her voice, only slightly, but enough to hold every breath in the room. You say this is about fame, but the judge you represent appeared on 3 cable news shows before even filing his motion against me. She held up a photo. Judge Kessler smiling on Morning Joe, sitting beside a host who called her a reckless provocateur. He used his bench like a spotlight, and when I responded with facts, you called it a performance. She took a step closer to the jury. Box. I was 29 when this started. I lost my publisher, my speaking agency, and 2 years of my life fighting to prove that I wasn't the liar he claimed I was. My dad mortgaged his house to help me fund discovery. That's not a performance. That's reality. Gasps rippled. Even. One juror blinked away tears. Karoline reached into her binder and pulled out a worn letter, creased and faded. This letter was written to me by a girl named Mariella. She was 15. She said watching me stand up to Judge Kessler made her believe she could fight the school board that ignored her abuse complaint. She said, "If you lose, I'll still speak up. But if you win, maybe they'll listen to me too." She looked up. Her voice didn't waver. "You say this is meaningless? That's funny. Because to the people who've been silenced, smeared, or ignored, this isn't meaningless. This is everything." She folded the letter gently. And then, without warning, she pressed a remote. Behind her, the projector flickered on. It displayed a new email. Not from Kessler, from Rothstein himself, sent during jury selection. Subject: push delay, media angle needed. Message: if we can bait Karoline into a public outburst, it will validate our narrative. Push harder in opening. The courtroom froze. The silence was deafening. Rothstein turned pale. "Objection!" He choked, but the judge didn't respond. He was too busy reading the email. Karoline let the moment breathe. Then she turned back slowly and delivered the final blow. "You didn't just try to discredit me. You tried to provoke me into discrediting myself. And when I didn't break, you broke the law." No one moved. No one spoke. Then, like thunder cracking through still air, someone stood in the back and began to clap. It echoed once, twice. Then others joined in, first one row, then another. A wave of applause surged through the courtroom, uncontainable. The TU judge pounded the gavel, but even he looked dazed, and Rothstein he sat down, not defeated, obliterated. His hands covered his mouth, his jaw clenched. His silence said more than any defense he could have mounted. Karoline remained still. She didn't bask in it. She didn't smile. She simply said, "I rest my case." Karoline Leavitt just detonated the courtroom with evidence from Rothstein's own email. This isn't a verdict. It's a public execution. Judge looked stunned. Jury erupting in emotion. Rothstein crushed. Total mic drop. Justice has a new name, Karoline. But just as the applause began to die down, a court officer entered through the side door and approached the bench. He whispered something into the judge's ear. The judge's eyes widened. He tapped his gavel twice and cleared his throat. "There has been a development, one that requires immediate disclosure to both parties." Karoline narrowed her eyes. Rothstein looked up, dazed and confused. And that's when the real shock came next. The courtroom remained breathless. Judge Harold Whitcomb looked up from the sealed envelope just handed to him. His voice, calm but commanding, broke the tension. "In light of this new evidence," he said, tapping the email printout, "the jury has requested no further deliberation. They are prepared to render their decision." Karoline stood silently, hands clasped. Warren Rothstein didn't even rise. His eyes were glazed, his jaw slack. The man who had strutted in like a political titan now looked like he was shrinking into his own suit. The jury forewoman stood. "In the matter of Leavitt versus Kessler, the room held its breath. We find in favor of the plaintiff. Damages awarded $800 million. A collective gasp erupted. Karoline inhaled, steady, not triumphant, vindicated. Rothstein blinked, stunned. But what came next wasn't rage, it was resignation. He rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and gave Karoline a long look, more hollow than hateful. Then he turned and walked out. No final plea, no statement, no dignity, just the echo of footsteps marking the end of his relevance. The cameras outside flashed like lightning as the doors opened and Karoline emerged into a sea of reporters, supporters, and stunned spectators. A single microphone was thrust. Toward her. Her voice was strong, her gaze steady. This wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a message. She looked out at the crowd, not just those before her, but the millions watching online. To anyone who's ever been told to sit down, stay silent, or stop asking questions, don't. A pause. In the end, intelligence, merit, and truth always rise above arrogance and manipulation. She held up Mariella's letter one last time. This victory is not just mine, it's for the 15-year-old girl who thought she didn't matter. It's for every whistleblower, survivor, and fighter who was told their story didn't count. You do count. The crowd erupted into applause, louder than before. A reporter shouted, "Karoline, what's next?" She smiled, but it wasn't for the cameras. We rebuild. We educate. We protect those who dare to speak. She stepped down from the podium, disappearing into the crowd, not a media star, but something rarer, a symbol of earned power. She didn't just win a case, she rewrote the playbook. From silenced to unstoppable. Karoline. Leavitt just became the face of justice. $800 million in damages. But the real value? The truth she proved. Now it's your turn. Do you think justice was served? Have you ever been silenced for telling the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you believe in standing up against corruption and silencing tactics, share this video. Let's make sure the powerful know we're not afraid to fight back. Justice doesn't belong to the elite. It belongs to the brave. Karoline 1. Truth on trial. Chung justice served.